Welcome back. Chapter 14, Ruth. Okay. Unhealthy patterns echo down family lines. They bequeath from generations to generation, like blue chip stocks or hair color. But there is a silver lining. If we're aware of them, we can edit the script that feels embedded in our genes. When I left home, I vowed to never repeat my mother's mistakes. I wouldn't deliberately hurt my child. I would protect Catherine with my life. I knew I wouldn't have a lot of money or a nice house. I'd never graduate from high school or go to Rome. But I would always have my daughter. In many ways, my life has unfolded as I envisioned it when I fled nearly a quarter century ago with nothing but a few $100, a stolen watch, and a duffel bag. My father may have lost all the pride he had in me, but I think he would be pleased with how Catherine turned out. A college-educated nurse with his beautiful golden brown skin and near obsession with ketchup. He would love her so much. Maybe he would still love me a little bit too. Catherine is my reason for pushing back against the darkness that has snaked through the lines of females in my family. The ugly legacy that has caused so much pain and destruction. She is my fresh start. I've succeeded in not repeating my mother's mistakes, but I've made new ones that are all my own. Terrible ones that have caused my daughter unnecessary pain. Is this her admitting to coming in between her? Okay. I settled deeper into the pillows propped on my bed with a sign. My lower back aches tonight from carrying too many heavy trays, so I added Epsom salt to the hot water when I took my bath. It would be a gift if I could empty my mind and relax, but that's impossible. I kept seeing James today. He was one car over at a stoplight this morning. He sat in the booth 7 this afternoon. He was the shadow in my bedroom that disappeared when I flicked on the light. He's drawing closer. I can sense it. Are they looking for her too? Soon, I'll see a car parked outside my apartment building late at night, its driver watching over me. And then I'll open the door and there he'll be. He'll pull me tightly against him, his strong arms wrapping around me. He's here with me now, too. The truth is, James has never left me. I reach for my old notebook again. I need to write down as much of my story as I can while I still can. Okay. James surprised me by showing up at school one day right after the final bell sounded. I was walking towards the bleachers that encircled the field where Palms practice was held when a cluster of students ahead of me parted, and there he was, as if conjured by my thoughts. I squealed and jumped into his arms. We kissed, a long, deep kiss. Someone hooted, but I didn't care who was watching. The saying, "in love," made sense for the first time in my life. Love wasn't just something I felt, like hunger or fatigue. I plunged deeply into it. It coursed through every one of my cells. I lost track of time. I often did when I was with James. We existed in our own universe. Our surroundings never mattered. James lived in a dreary room he rented from a widow who needed the income. He'd sneak me in there sometimes, the two of us dissolving into laughter as we tiptoed up the stairs. Luckily, the old woman was hard of hearing, and even though stains pocked the walls and the house smelled like dog pee, I didn't care about anything but James. He was tender and sexy and strong, and despite being estranged from his family and having to make his own way in the world, he never once complained. On that Wednesday afternoon, I finally detached myself from James and started to walk toward the field. He kept a hold of my hand and yanked me back in for one last lingering kiss. I protested that I'd see him in 3 hours since we were going out that night. James said it was too long to wait. I laughed. I did that a lot when I was with James. I always felt slightly tipsy around him. By the time I finally got down to the field, practice had begun. I tossed my backpack and water bottle onto the bleachers. I learned to keep my stuff far away from the sidelines and ran to join the others. The song Giddy Jitty With It with Will Smith was playing from Coach's tape deck, and the 11 other girls were in formation. But Coach held up his palm to me and told me to take a seat. At first, I thought they were creating a new routine, one that left me out. I wouldn't put it past Coach or Brittany. Then Coach told me I was being benched because I've been late 3 times in the past 2 weeks. I started to protest, then fell silent. I didn't think it was true, but James had been surprising me at the end of the school day fairly often lately. But I was only 5 minutes late, if that. And this was the first I'd heard of Coach tallying up my tardiness, or anyone's for that matter. Instead of going to sit on the bleachers, I remained on the sidelines a few feet down from him. Coach was trying to separate me from the team. I couldn't let him. I expected him to motion me to go in during the first break, but he just told the girls to do it again, this time with more energy. After another 10 minutes, I approached Coach and asked if I could go in. He didn't even look at me when he replied that I'd go in when he was good and ready. I swallowed my pride and apologized, promising I wouldn't be late again. His voice was clipped when he told me that we were not going to have this conversation now. So I waited. Coach resumed acting like I wasn't there. When practice was half over, I walked up to Coach again and asked if he was going to make me stand there the whole practice. He finally turned to me. I couldn't see his eyes behind his shiny aviator sunglasses. I disrespected everyone else's time, he sneered. So why did I suddenly think mine was so important? I'd already apologized. I wasn't going to do it again, not to him. Besides, it wasn't like a football play where no one could practice if I wasn't on the field. I repeated that I'd only been 5 minutes late. Then Coach said I'd had 2 warnings and today was my 3rd. He was bald-faced lying. He never given me a single warning. When I tried to say that, he held up his palm and turned his back on me. Anger flashed into me. Before I even knew what I was saying, I blurted out something I shouldn't have. I'd said I'd appreciate it if he could let me know when I'd be able to join practice, or maybe he needed Brittany or Miss Davis to tell him how long my punishment should be. Okay. That was a mistake. Something shifted in his body language. Coach had been a guy with big dreams once. Those rock star t-shirts, the Eric Clapton guitar behind glass in his office. He probably imagined girls screaming his name while he stood in the spotlight. Maybe he thought he still had power and prestige, even if it was only over a dozen high school girls. My words, loud enough for the whole team to hear, had just torn it away from him. He shouted that practice was over and ordered me into his office. Then Coach turned and strode off the field, throwing his clipboard to the grass. When he was safely out of earshot, Brittany hooted and clapped her hands together. I shot her the finger and followed Coach. Coach's office was a tiny room off the indoor basketball court. It was windowless and barely big enough to hold a desk, a file cabinet, and 2 chairs. Next door was the football coach's office, which was 4 times the size. That probably stung too. As I stepped inside, Coach ordered me to close the door. I obeyed. Coach took off his Ray-Bans and put them down on his desk. I stood there waiting for my lecture on respect and responsibility. He moved even closer to me, so near I could smell the mint gum he was chewing. Then he said that I must think pretty highly of myself. I knew better than to reply. Anything I said would only inflame him. Turns out, not answering didn't help either. The next thing that happened shocked me to my core. His voice was almost a whisper when he told me he'd seen me strutting around school like I was hot shit. I flinched because I never heard a teacher swear before. What he did after that was so strange. Coach began to walk in a slow circle around me as my skin prickled. It felt unnaturally quiet down here. No one was dribbling a basketball on the court. That season wouldn't start for another few months. The football players and coaches were all on the main field. Most of the teachers in the building had left for the day, and the only ones remaining were a floor or two above us. Coach was behind me now. I couldn't see him at all. I didn't move. There was nowhere to go in the tiny office. Plus, I knew if I walked out or spoke up, Coach would use it as an excuse to increase whatever punishment he had in mind. But there was something else holding me in place. Fear. It made no sense. I was in a public building with a teacher I'd known for years. Why did I feel as vulnerable and exposed as I did when I was a kid and my mother tore into my bedroom at night and yanked off my covers and began screaming at me for infractions I wasn't aware I'd committed? Coach's breath tickled my ear as he told me he'd seen me grinding against my boyfriend like I couldn't get enough of him. Coach. The building was air conditioned and down in the basement. It felt especially cold. I wanted to wrap my arms around myself, but I felt strangely immobilized. Coach kept walking until I could see him in my peripheral vision. He kept talking in that low, creepy voice, telling me he knew I was a hungry girl, that I was hungry for lots of things. He slid a hand across my abdomen and I instinctively sucked in. He smiled and I hated giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. He let his hand linger around my belly button and told me I was getting a little thick around the middle. Coach touched all of us girls sometimes. He stretched hamstrings and high-fived us and rubbed out Charlie horses. This touch felt different. Coach's hand moved higher until it was directly beneath my left breast. Then he said I was getting a little thick there too, that I'd been bouncing all over the place at practice. He skimmed his hand over my breast so quickly it was over before I even knew what was happening. My breast had felt tender the last few days, and his touch seemed amplified, like his hand was still there, his palm brushing my nipple, even after he withdrew it. Tears pricked my eyes. His voice snaked into my ear as he told me that 10 years from now, I was going to be a fat cow living in a double wide with a bunch of snotty kids while my husband jacked off to porn because he can't stand looking at me. I couldn't hold back my tears. They dripped silently down my cheek. Coach was stripping me raw, just like he'd done the night he made Brittany captain. But this was so much worse. Then I felt the trail of his finger sliding down below the elastic waistband of my elastic shorts and underpants and touching between my legs. Oh my goodness. I stopped breathing. I couldn't process what was happening. Coach pulled out his hand and stood in front of me. It felt like he was feasting on my tears. He reached out in a gesture that might seem sympathetic if I hadn't seen the gleam in his eyes. He pulled me close to him, as close as I'd been to James only an hour ago. He asked if he was being too hard on me. His arms tightened around me, trapping me as he rocked his hips forward. He meant the double entry. I'm going to highlight that word because I don't know the definition. The worst part was I didn't fight back. I didn't even try to pull away. I just stood there and took it as he ground his pelvis against me as his breath started coming faster. It felt like I left my body, but unlike the other night when I fought with my mother and went to a place so dark it blinded me, this time I floated up to the ceiling where I could see everything. I knew what was happening. Coach was getting his rocks off through the thin layer of our clothing, but it didn't feel like it was happening to me. It was over in what could have been 60 seconds or 10 minutes. Coach quickly walked around behind his desk and sat down. His face was flushed. Suddenly, his tone was businesslike again. He told me that since I refused to give him a formal apology when he requested one, he had no choice but to kick me off the team. I couldn't process his words. It felt like they were coming at me from all directions, as if I was in an echo chamber. Coach rustled a few papers on his desk, not looking at me, as he said he'd move up someone from JV to take my place, and that he'd email the principal and Miss Davis and the team to let them know. Whatever Coach claimed, Mrs. Davis and Brittany and half of the other girls would back him up. The truth never had a chance, just like I never did. Sorry, y'all. I couldn't say a word. Ice still encased me, but somehow I managed to walk out of his office. I went directly to my car where Rosie was waiting for me, holding the backpack and water bottle I left on the bleachers. She frowned as she peered at my face and asked if I was okay. Sure, I replied. I may have even smiled. I probably didn't look any different than when I followed Coach into his office. I was still wearing my shorts and t-shirts and socks and sneakers. My hair was still up in a blue and gold twisted scrunchies. I wasn't even crying. But I wasn't the same girl. I wouldn't ever be her again. I told James everything that night. When he'd held me, it didn't erase Coach's touch, but it helped thaw me out. It was hard to keep talking when I got to the part about Coach's fingers sliding down inside my underpants and what happened afterwards, but James didn't react. He kept looking at me gently and steadily, like he was entering into that awful space alongside me so I wouldn't be alone. When I finished talking, James told me Coach wasn't going to get away with it. James didn't seem angry, despite his words. His voice was calm. He wasn't even frowning. Those are the ones you got to be careful of. I was glad he wanted to stick up for me, but I shook my head. Who would believe me? By now, Coach's word had settled deep in my brain. Lots of people had seen James and I making out after school. It's not like I had a stellar reputation, which shouldn't matter, but double standards exist. They do. James had a whole plan mapped out before I even realized where he was taking me in his car. When we pulled up at my high school, my whole body recoiled. I couldn't imagine ever setting foot inside the halls again. I'd always be scared Coach would call me into his office on a made-up excuse, like to return my uniform and close the door behind us. I whispered that I didn't want to be here, but James asked if I trusted him, and I nodded. Then he asked if I wanted to make Coach pay. I did more than anything. James opened his car door, then came around to my side and opened mine. He led me to the side door we'd used to enter the school before. He told me to wait and he'd let me in. He disappeared and I knew he was pulling himself in through the upper story window, the one that was always cracked open. He took longer to appear than I'd expected. I began to shiver, even though it wasn't cold out. Finally, the door opened with a loud squeak. James had turned on the hall light and he was backlit, so he looked almost like a silhouette at first. I instinctively recoiled. Then my eyes adjusted and I saw James was holding the silver Louisville Slugger. I expected him to take me to the wrestling room again, but he veered the other way. He took me to Coach's office. My whole body was trembling now. James reached for the door handle. It was locked. He looked at me and shrugged, and for a second, I thought that was it. We were going to turn around and do something else tonight. Then James began to kick the door with the hard sole of his shoe. again and again as the cheap hollow door shuddered. It only took a half dozen kicks until the wood around the knob began to splinter and the door gave way. I half expected people to come running at the noise, but of course the building had been empty for hours. Somehow, breaking in removed the menace from this room. James knew exactly what I needed to offset the sickening helplessness I felt in this space. James flickered on the overhead light. Coach's shiny sunglasses were still on the desk, right where he put them after he brought me in here. James handed me the bat and told me it was all mine. I lifted it above my head and brought it down on the sunglasses. The impact of the bat against the metal desk jarred my arms all the way down to their sockets. The sunglasses flew off the table, their frames crushed. Then James pointed to the Clapton guitar. Ooh. The words "I can't" died on my lips. Sure I could. Coach had taken something far more valuable from me than a piece of memorabilia. I stepped forward, holding the bat over my shoulder like I was waiting for a pitch. The room was so small I checked behind me to make sure James wouldn't get hit by my backswing. I took a deep breath, then let loose. The guitar was completely ruined by the fourth hit, but I whacked it until my arms grew tired. When I finally handed James the bat, he winked at me and said our work here was almost done. That was when I heard the distant sounds of footsteps coming down the hallway. Panic shot through me. Coach would probably suspect I was behind the vandalism, but I could create an alibi with James. Our school didn't have any cameras or security guards. No one could prove it was us, unless an eyewitness saw me and James. While all this ran through my head, James was moving around. The destroyed guitar in this case had fallen to the floor behind the desk, so he didn't need to hide them from any passerbys. He pushed the door all the way open so you couldn't immediately tell it was damaged, and he left the lights on. James was still holding the bat, which was evident of what we've done. The sound of shoe soles slapping against the linoleum floor was just down the hall now, drawing closer with every step. James was so calm, he had to have a plan, but he was moving too slowly. There was nowhere to hide. We'd be caught. My heart felt like it was about to burst. I wouldn't just be kicked off the Pom Squad. I'd probably be kicked out of school. The police would arrive and everyone would know what I'd done. I might even get arrested. Right before he came into view, I heard Coach's voice. He called out the name Donna. That was our vice principal, as if he was expecting to see her. It was all over. Coach was coming. We were about to be discovered. I shrank back into the office, but James did the opposite. He lifted the bat and stepped forward in perfect timing for the bat to explode in a half circle and meet Coach's stomach as Coach rounded the corner and stepped over the threshold into his office. Later, I pieced together what had happened. James told me some details when he drove me home that night, and the rest I put together through newspaper articles I've researched. At the beginning of the night, while I was waiting outside the school, wondering what was taking James so long, James broke into the main office and found Coach's phone number on a list of contact information for teachers. He called Coach and identified himself as a police officer who wanted to alert Coach about a break-in at the school and the theft of his signed guitar. He told Coach that the assistant principal, Donna, was already at the scene in Coach's office. Coach came rushing in. He hadn't surprised us after all. It was James who surprised him. The next afternoon, Coach died from his injuries. The papers reported that he'd been hit more than 24 times with a baseball bat that was found at the scene. By the time Coach was being removed from machines that had worked to keep his body alive, I was stepping off a bus, arriving in a city 100 miles away from my hometown. The girl I was before, Ava Morales, was gone. Ava Morales, where'd that name come from? I had the gold watch James took off of Coach Rich. What? I had the gold watch James took off Coach's wrist, a little cash, and a duffel bag with a few of my belongings. James became the lead suspect quickly, and I was a suspect too. They called us Oak Hill High Teen Killers, and a tabloid ran photos of the two of us side by side on the front page. I knew no one would believe me if I told the truth and said James summoned Coach to the office and swung the bat before I even knew what was happening. Of all the images of the night of the attack that I kept replaying, there's one I go back to the most. James setting the bat down on the floor, then looking at me as he grabs Coach's limp arm and dragged Coach deeper into the office, leaving a trail of smeared blood. James' eyes were as gentle and untroubled as if we just finished making love. His eyes were the most terrifying things I'd ever seen. When I saw them, I began to tremble so hard my teeth chattered. I tried to pick up the phone on Coach's desk to call an ambulance, but James pulled me away. Never leave fingerprints, he told me as he wiped down the bat with his t-shirt. Then he gave me instructions. We'd go home and grab whatever valuables we could. The old lady he hoarded with had a safe in her bedroom James wanted to break into. Then we'd meet at Pizza Pizzaio at midnight. We'd run to a place where no one could ever find us. We'd be gone tonight. James paused in yanking the gold watch off of Coach's wrist and stared at me. He asked if I was going to come with him. When I didn't answer immediately, James let Coach's arm drop roughly to the floor and he moved closer to me. I glanced at the baseball bat still within James' reach. If I thought I'd been terrified before, now I knew true fear. I blurted that of course I'd meet him at the restaurant. James held up the watch close to my face and pointed to the 12 at the top of the circle. I heard the faint sound that would grow to haunt me. Tick, tock, tick, tock. James slipped the watch onto my wrist and told me not to lose track of time. He said he'd see me at midnight. But I ran alone. You were already growing in my stomach by then, even though I didn't know it yet. I probably got pregnant that very first time with James under the stars. You gave me a new purpose, one that burned through me and kept me going during the day, during all the hard, scary times ahead. I knew I had to hide for the rest of my life. It wasn't merely self-preservation. My goal was to keep you safe too, Catherine. Everyone would know you were the daughter of the teen killers. You'd be a curiosity and worse, a pariah. And when James and I were both sent to prison, as we surely would be, my mother and father would probably be given custody of you. For long hours every day while my father was at work and Timmy at school, you'd be alone with my mother. I needed to do whatever it took to break the pattern, even if it meant that in a way I would die too. Woo, that's the end of chapter 14. Now that was a heavy chapter. We got a little bit more information. I was scared for a minute because I thought the coach was going to do something which caused her to be pregnant with Catherine, but it was James. But that's not even better because James is appearing to be a psychopath. And then I remember in the previous chapter, she said she wondered if she got some other things from her father as well because she was rubbing her feet like her father. Remember that? So it sounded like her parents didn't kick her out. She was running from James. So does that mean James is going to be looking for her soon? Wow. Okay. So There was one word that I did not know the definition of, and stay tuned for the definition portion. Okay, I'm back with the word, and it is spelled Entendre, and this is a definition of it.
Entendre. Entendre.
Okay, so entendre is a double meaning: to hear, to understand. It's a verb. Okay, so that's the end of the definition portion. I shall see you in the next chapter, which is chapter 15. Bye.